The world ended on a Tuesday. It was not slow, nor was there any warning of what would happen over the years to come, like the historians would later come to describe it, but rather it happened in 2 hours of nuclear warfare that obliterated every major country and everything else in the time that it takes to watch a movie. 2 hours. And then what happened? The ash clouds, the fallout, nothing but ruins and scorched earth. But there is one thing that sat just out of focus in the background while all that destruction was happening, and that no one ever seems to notice or talk about. The oceans are still there, they didn't go anywhere. Every body of water that existed on that fateful morning of October 23rd, 2077, exists today as well. The ocean remains how it was, unchanged, at least when it comes to location. So what actually happened to it? What did 200 years of nuclear fallout, industrial pollution, FEV contamination, and every other catastrophe the fallout world could produce actually do to the largest body of water on the planet? And more importantly, what is living in it right now? This is what happened to the ocean in Fallout, and what the games have been suggesting is down there is considerably more disturbing than most people have stopped to think about. Before the bombs. If you are looking to figure out what happened to the ocean in Fallout, then you are first going to have to take a look at what was being done to it prior to October 23rd, 2077, because the main issue with the ocean didn't start in the Great War. It inherited a problem that was years in the making. The pre-war Fallout world isn't a pristine world that got ruined by nuclear bombs. The world was in the middle of eating itself alive, and the ocean was one of the first places to feel the strain. Resource wars defined the pre-war era, and were driven nearly entirely by the global scarcity of oil starting about 2052. Because oil had grown scarce, corporations and governments both pressed forward with increased offshore drilling, deep-sea mining, and experimental energy solutions that prioritized efficiency of production over environmental concerns. Poseidon Energy had multiple platforms spread throughout the Pacific. On at least one of these, the nuclear reactor had been pumping a great deal of pollution into the ocean, and the currents had been pushing that waste south towards the coast of Mexico. That is one platform that we know of, one recorded event. Seeing the pre-war level of corporate action and general fallout disregard for environmental regulations of the mid-21st century, we can safely assume that this wasn't an uncommon incident. The Nahant Oceanological Society, the pre-war equivalent of an oceanological society in coastal Massachusetts, had been recording a variety of findings on their own terminal logs, available to the sole survivor within the confines of ruined buildings in Fallout 4. According to those logs, their research found researchers documenting real-time genetic mutation in the shellfish species of Massachusetts, including average increases in weight among crabs by 14% and lobsters by 12% prior to the bombs even falling. They even attempted to report their findings to the Boston Port Authority, which would not even take their calls. The data was available, it was clear the problem was present, but the response system responsible simply failed to act. They attempted to relay the information to Galaxy News Network, which broadcast only that it was going to be a bountiful shellfish harvest. The ocean in Fallout had become ill prior to the dropping of the first bombs, and America in the pre-war period knew it. Yet the bombs did not change anything yet. The nation had inherited a problem and exponentially made it worse. America in Fallout was not simply neglectful towards environmental policy. It was aggressive in its disregard. It was impossible for corporations tied deeply to the government to follow strict regulations. And resource wars specifically encouraged extracting as much as could possibly be gathered from any available source as quickly as possible, deferring any potential problems that would arise, one of which was the ocean. Radiation from the power plants had already begun being dispersed throughout the waters around them, and together with the bombs coming, that disaster would be irreversible. Decades of industrial dumping, the radiation that continued to be produced by each offshore nuclear power plant, and the budding stages of FEV contamination in the waters of military installations close to coastlines had already set a dangerous process in motion, a process the war was the start of. And what this intensified disaster looked like is something that, sadly, the games never really show you, which is precisely why it is so important to know exactly how it happened, what the bombs caused. This is something the Fallout games show you without ever showing you at all. On the world maps of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, the Pacific Ocean just off the California coast is brown. Not blue-green like a normal ocean, but brown, like pollution, like runoff, like water that has been absorbing the wrong stuff for far too long. Only as you pan the camera away from the coastline and over open water does it slowly clear, before the fallout carried from the land has dispersed. This was a detail that was put in from 1997. It wasn't a technical limit. It was a clear, deliberate decision by the developers to demonstrate the state of the coastal water without ever needing to make a quest around around it, or ever have any of the characters mention it at all. The nuclear warheads detonated on coastlines have destroyed more than just what was on them. The direct fallout contamination released into the atmosphere would have been spread across the planet by currents, with particularly devastating levels on both sides of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. 2 centuries is a hell of a long time for an ecosystem to cope with environmental catastrophe. Testing atomic weapons in the Pacific in the 1940s and 50s in our own timeline had a noticeable, if still fairly limited, impact on marine life for decades, and that's talking about a tiny fraction of the actual nuclear destruction unleashed during Fallout's Great War. 2 centuries of ongoing contamination over 2 major coastlines with no cleanup, no monitoring, and no attempted intervention makes the question of whether it is contaminated completely redundant. It would be what all those creatures living in the water have become. As it turns out, it is this question which the Fallout series actually answers. They just tend to spread its scope all over the 2 coasts. So first let's have a look at what is visible on the surface, because what has evolved out of these waters is horrifying enough. The crabs on the surface. First let's deal with the more visually apparent. The creature that populates the shores and shallows of the Fallout Ocean are all evidence that something utterly terrible occurred within the water. The Mirelurk is probably the most recognizable sea creature within the franchise, and is considerably more than people credit them as. According to research terminals within Fallout 4, namely from the Nahant Oceanological Society document, the standard Mirelurk possesses 2 vastly different species markers. That is, it possesses DNA markers from both the Atlantic horseshoe crab, which is evolutionarily closer to arachnids than crustaceans, and the Atlantic blue crab. For a single organism to hold both would indicate that radiation not only changed the crab, but combined it with something wholly incompatible, hence the designation of a separate genus for the wasteland researchers called Scylla serrata hirendusus. The name was originally given to the creatures by the Lone Wanderer in an interaction with Moira Brown while she was compiling the Wasteland Survival Guide. The naming of the species was a bit of a joke. The fact that it still stands as the scientific classification of the creature remains funny, but a little terrifying. Mirelurks are far more long-lived mutations than most suspect as well. The Nahant research terminals indicate that shellfish were already exhibiting anomalies in their growth and population numbers for years before the Great War, and so already being bombarded with radioactive pollution by Poseidon Energy and the like. The Mirelurks were already becoming what they are before the bombs fell. The Great War did not so much create them, but rather finish a process already in motion, and that distinction is important. The bombs did not create the Mirelurk, they finished it. Mirelurks living in the shallow post-war waters are not a consequence of a single catastrophe. They are a consequence of decades of immense pressure that the war only pushed over the threshold of being viable. And we have the Mirelurk Queen. While the standard Mirelurk is horrifying, the Mirelurk Queen is truly something that makes you question what the water is doing. Coming in at nearly 4 meters, able to hurl acid at range, completely covered in thick armor, and able to instantly reproduce hundreds of eggs in response to stimuli, the Mirelurk Queen is clearly a creature that did not evolve for the purpose of living within the coastal shallows. She is a creature of the deep who simply resides there now because she is too large to be prey. Such size cannot possibly come from anywhere but deeper within the Atlantic. The Mirelurk King, a bipedal variant that fires waves of sonic energy and possesses superficial similarity to the humanoid silhouette, is perhaps the most disturbing member of the entire family. An organism that was a crab has now stood on 2 legs, developed ranged sonic attacks, and is similar enough to the silhouette of a person to be easily mistaken from a distance. 200 years in radioactive waters, and the crabs can already almost stand on 2 legs, and that's not even a metaphor. A Mirelurk King can stand on 2 legs, they communicate with sound waves, they can fight back at range, and they seem to possess an impressive level of communication that borders on social behavior. Whatever 200 more years of the same pressure and process yields remains largely unexplained by the franchise. The Mirelurks and Mirelurk Queens that live in the shallows are but mere versions of the ongoing evolution of this ecosystem. That is hardly the final stage of evolution within the ocean. And whatever is out there and not living in the shallows where you can readily see them, deep in the depths under more pressure, less light, and greater contamination, are continuing with less interference. The same transformation, whatever that is created, has yet to be uncovered. 200 years in radioactive waters, and the crabs can nearly stand up. So what are the creatures further offshore like? That is a question the franchise takes most most seriously during the Far Harbor DLC for Fallout 4, and the answer to that question is truly disturbing. What the Fog is hiding, Far Harbor is a DLC for Fallout 4 that takes place on an island off the coast of Maine, and it is the closest this franchise has ever gotten to actually showing you what the post-war Atlantic is doing to whatever happens to inhabit it. These details, at least, are saying a very particular thing to anyone looking for it. The island of Far Harbor is perpetually shrouded in a radioactive fog that seeps in from the ocean, one dense enough to be deadly to an unprotected human, one thick enough to obscure the shoreline and making journeys outside of specified safe paths genuinely almost impossible. That fog isn't just atmosphere either, it's actively carrying something. Far Harbor loading screen tips reveal that fog crawlers are, of all things, the result of mutations to native shrimp colonies as a result of exposure to Far Harbor's pervasive radioactive fog. This shrimp creature is taller than a deathclaw, moves with a speed that can only be described as impossible for a creature its size, has armor-plated carapace that makes it resistant to just about any ballistic projectile in the franchise, and has a file name on the game data that says, quite plainly, the Deep One. The latter is not, strictly speaking, lore, but is an unambiguous piece of evidence of what the developers were doing conceptually, and it's that they were conceptualizing something ancient and enormous that emerged from some place beneath. The anglers, mutated deep-sea anglerfish in shallow Maine coastal waters, equipped with bioluminescent lures for life in total darkness. The adaptation for an anglerfish to employ a bioluminescent lure takes millions of years of evolution to come about. The sheer fact of its presence at all means that the pressures that gave rise to this creature involved time and environments that shallow coastal waters can't replicate. It's telling you, in the language of evolutionary biology, that the anglers emerged from a way deeper place. Just think about what that means. The anglers are equipped with a bioluminescent lure because the environments they evolved in have no light. An angler that emerges in the shallow waters of Maine, which obviously has light, and thus has no need for such an adaptation, meaning that the pressures applied to this creature's ancestors included an extremely prolonged existence within environments lacking light at all. The radioactive fog provides one source for these pressures, and the deep ocean provides another. The two might even be related. On top of all that, there's giant hermit crabs in Far Harbor that use trucks and trailers as shells, while ordinary hermit crabs use standard minuscule shells. These utilize broken cars for shelter, and only do so because there are no ordinary natural hermit crab shells anywhere in any environment that could house them. The scale of mutation here is, in a single island, simply unbelievable, and it is all stemming from the water that the island is around. Old Longfellow, who will accompany you through the DLC as your guide, describes the deep fog dwellers as things specifically, carefully. Not animals, not creatures, not monsters, just things. He's lived there a long time, and he knows the careful word choice to get as close to accurate as humanly possible when something doesn't fit the available terms. He's telling you, on behalf of the franchise, that whatever is residing in the deepest parts of the fog and its underlying waters doesn't fit neatly into any category he knows of, and that he's not being imprecise, quite the opposite, and that precision is the most direct answer this franchise has ever given to the question of what is in the Fallout Ocean. Nothing that he knows how to name. That island is a glimpse of the absolute edge. Far Harbor is the shoreline, the place where land makes contact with sea, and the game is doing its best to keep you firmly on one side of that line. The lore hints at what is out there, though, for those paying close enough attention. There is one last, easily overlooked piece of the puzzle from Far Harbor worth consideration before proceeding. The radioactive fog blanketing the island, rendering it hostile to unprotected humans, isn't produced on the island. It seeps in from the sea, from all the way out there. The creatures who now call the deep fog home, fog crawlers, anglers, and the things that old Longfellow can't even name, aren't creatures that evolved to cope with the fog once it arrived. They are creatures that traveled with the fog, or that come from the same deep ocean source that the fog itself does, or that were shaped by the deep ocean pressures that also create the fog. The island isn't the source. The island is merely the nearest point that humans can access that source from without immediately vanishing. What that source is a question this franchise has assiduously, carefully avoided answering. The open ocean. This is where we have to be honest with each other about something. Fallout doesn't contain a lot of official lore about the deep ocean. The games are set on land after all. The player characters are not equipped with submarines. Nobody has ever witnessed the post-war floor of the Atlantic or Pacific return returned and survived to report it. But there are little bits of lore, and when pieced together, they paint a picture more complete than might be expected. The first is Ada from Fallout 4. Ada is a robot companion, and during her dialogues while on the shore of the sea, players usually gloss over this line. But it's not just flavor dialogue. If the radioactive waste hyper-evolved the horseshoe crab, what do you think it did to the rest of the life in the sea? This is the game explicitly throwing the question out there, and leaving you to fill in the gaps, which in itself tells you everything you need to know about how the things visible on the shore came to be. They're the products of 200 years of radiation on a pre-existing ecosystem, and the exact same processes have been at play on everything that the game doesn't show you too. The second is the color of the water in Fallout 1 and 2. It's brown and dirty when close to land, clearing the further out you get. That's important because it says two things. First, that there's a gradient of contamination, with the heaviest occurring closest to shore, which is true for real-world sea contamination, and second, that that specific contamination is what's coloring the water. The actual fallout has dispersed into the rest of the ocean, but its effect is not diminished at all. The third is the Poseidon oil rig. It exists in the Pacific Ocean, 175 miles offshore the coast of California. This rig was used as the Enclave's headquarters, has a known nuclear reactor on it that leaks radiation into the water, and research involving FEV was conducted on the rig. Depending on your actions as the chosen one, the Poseidon oil rig is obliterated with an atomic explosion. That tells you something about the conditions out in the Pacific Ocean, 175 miles offshore, 200 years post-war. It doesn't tell you what exactly happened out there, but that isn't to say nothing has happened. The fourth is the cut content from Fallout 4. There was an underwater vault planned, a vault beneath the sea floor. It was later removed, but notes in the game's files speak of it, as well as story content concerning larger creatures that are encountered while exploring it. Again, it isn't exactly canon, but it's an indication of what the developers considered a significant part of the underwater world. So significant that it inspired an entire vault and was enough to write interesting story elements for. So when you combine it all, you get the image of an open ocean that has been bombarded with radioactive material for 200 years, contains at least one site that experimented with FEV biological samples, has sea creatures on its coastlines that have undergone 200 years of extreme mutation and has never been explored. 200 years is a very long time, and we do know the ocean contains more radiation and is filled with far more mutated animals than would typically be found in one spot, and all of those things have had 200 years to develop without anyone seeing what is happening. And the next thing we will be doing is trying to see the extent of what did actually happen, but before that, we have one more point of confirmed Fallout lore. Fallout 76 has the Appalachian coastline, and the ocean is equally impassable and equally impossibly radioactive. While the fog of Fallout 76 appears to be tied specifically to Vault 94 and is caused by its Gek, the fog crawlers it originated share design elements with the fog crawlers found in Fallout 4, suggesting that, similar to how a GET explosion would catalyze radioactive mutations that mimic those in Fallout 4, the process can occur without one. The Atlantic had 200 years of fallout directed at it. It didn't need a Gek explosion to kickstart it. It was just the long, slow burn of a 2-century-long process. What is down there? The world's oceans make up roughly 94% of the volume of life on the planet, and they are almost entirely microscopic. A significant amount of that life resides in the deep ocean, where there is no light at all, and the pressure will crush an unprotected human being in milliseconds. The creatures that are adapted to live at such depths are already, for our perspective, completely alien. The anglerfish and the giant squid, together with most creatures that can make their own light. These creatures have barely changed over millions of years, because the deep sea is one of the most stable environments on the planet. Now, consider that this environment has had over 2 centuries of elevated radiation, FEV contamination, from at least one documented source off the coast of Massachusetts, and genetic acceleration. The surface creatures we saw provide the template. Horseshoe crabs and blue crabs have merged, producing creatures capable of standing upright, ultimately spitting out sonic blasts. Shrimp have been mutated to be as large as deathclaws and equipped with bulletproof carapaces. Anglerfish have been adapted to hunt on land using the same tactics that worked at the bottom of the ocean. If surface life managed this in 200 years, the deep ocean home to already alien life and subject to utterly different pressures of darkness and crushing depth is almost certainly operating by rules entirely unknown to us at the coastline. There is not merely one deep sea. There are dozens, one on top of the other, each with distinct temperature, pressure, and light levels. The abyssal zone, 3,000 to 6,000 meters deep, houses organisms adapted to an environment that would instantly kill any creature on the surface. 200 years of radiation and FEV acting on organisms already perfectly adapted to one of the most extreme environments in the world is something the franchise has not dared to tackle directly. The giant squid of the World Sea IE currently reach 13 meters in length. They are ambush predators with eyes the size of dinner plates, tentacles covered in suckers reinforced with chitin, and the capacity to drag prey down into darkness in a split second. They exist now, and in the Fallout timeline they have been absorbing elevated radiation for as long as the ocean can remember. Turn a giant squid into something that lives on the surface by the same process that turned a crab into a Mirelurk king, and you have a creature that, to our knowledge, has no name. Then we have the whales, the largest animals that have ever lived and that are in our oceans now. Blue whales have been known to reach over 30 meters in length and weigh more than 200 tons. In the Fallout universe, they have been absorbing elevated radiation in waters with FEV contamination. We have absolutely no idea what this mutation process, which can turn a crab into a Mirelurk queen, would do to an animal already. That enormous. And finally, there is the issue of what the seafloor actually looks like. Every city within range of a coastline deposited materials into the ocean. Buildings, vehicles, pre-war technology, and anything and everything that was inside research facilities, military installations, and Poseidon energy plants. All of this has settled over the past centuries. But since the Fallout universe is known for pre-war technology that still works, why should we assume that technology dropped into the ocean stopped working immediately? There is no reason to believe that whatever lies on the seafloor, having had all this time to fuse with organic material in each other, would still be remotely identifiable or safe. FEV had research sites all over the world. FEV contamination in a marine environment with existing rapidly mutating organisms is an environmental crisis of unknown proportions that the surface dwellers will likely never investigate. And if the veteran of irradiated island life, Old Longfellow, cannot even name the creatures lurking in the deepest fogs, how can we even begin to comprehend the things that exist in the open ocean? Far beyond his sight, the games, to their credit, know precisely what they are doing by keeping it out of view. Why it's not explored. There is both a practical and a lore-based reason for why the Fallout series has never taken you under the sea, and it is worthwhile understanding both. There is the practical reason, and before we can get into the far more interesting lore reason, it's worth getting this out of the way. The ocean in Fallout is a design problem. Open-world games have mechanics that reward you with content that you stumble across while exploring a space. While the natural ocean can be traversed, it lacks any sort of vertical variety or landmark density, and is difficult to pepper with content enough to make the massive undertaking of its creation justifiable. While there is still more to explore in the existing wasteland building, Out the Sea would in fact feel like building an entire second game within a second, and at a significant enough level of investment to ask an entire studio to invest resources that could be going elsewhere in a franchise that already has more landmass to fill for hundreds of hours. The ocean requires entirely new movement mechanics, a new combat system, and new visual and audio design, a new approach to survival mechanics, all of which would be extremely time and resource intensive to implement and make comparable to the existing land-based systems which would already be providing that same breadth of content on land, and the Fallout franchise has consistently chosen to put those resources in expanding the wasteland rather than the sea. That was a creative decision that makes sense and can't be blamed as a flaw on anyone, as the wasteland alone offers a virtually inexhaustible number of places to go, a fact that has been repeatedly demonstrated and leaves the ocean as the most underdeveloped place within one of the most intensely developed game settings, a total and complete hole of potential to fill as more and more lore touches its shores. But there is also the lore-based reason, and this is the most fascinating one. The ocean in Fallout functions as what the wasteland surface was before the vaults opened, a place that survivors know is out there, that they know has been changed by the same forces that changed everything else, but that they cannot explore safely and therefore cannot document. The Wastelanders of the Fallout world do not have submarines or deep-sea research vessels. They barely have boats. The ocean is, from their perspective, exactly what the horizon always is in survival scenarios, which is a boundary past which everything is unknown. And that unknown quality is a tremendous value to the franchise. The wasteland is dangerous, but it is the kind of dangerous that is documented and that you can prepare for. There are maps of the wasteland. There are settlements that have survived. The Brotherhood has compiled documentation on most of the major threats on both the east and west coast. coasts. The NCR is governing a large portion of the Southwest. Over 200 years have passed, and much of the wasteland has, as a result, been discovered and understood. And that could not be said of the ocean. There is no place in the Fallout universe as utterly undocumented as the seas. The ocean is one of the most effective forms of horror in the Fallout franchise, that of what is simply implied rather than seen directly. When Old Longfellow describes the things in the deep fog not as creatures but as things, the franchise has arrived at its most vague but most effective. He doesn't name them because they don't know, or rather, none of the wasteland dwellers know, because it is the one place where no one has come back to be able to describe it. The wasteland is horrifying, but it is a known horrifying place. One can map it. The ocean, on the other hand, cannot be settled. It cannot be discovered and mapped from a safe distance. And it's not like it's a question of if what exists within it can be reasoned or can be bargained with, or if it can be avoided by going a different way. It is merely a thing on the border of every coastal game, where it has been existing far longer than even the wasteland has. The future it is confirmed that Fallout 5 is in development with Bethesda, but the location for the game has not been confirmed yet. There isn't really any reason to assume that the next game is on the coast, but there are very good reasons to assume that if the game, or a future game in the series, goes to sea, then the lore will be in place for something truly special. The pre-war pollution, the FEV contamination of offshore waters, and coastal mutation shown throughout every game set near the coast or the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean. The scale of what has the potential to live in deeper water is obvious, with the single line from Ada, careful wording from Old Longfellow, and file name for the fog crawler. The franchise has been setting something up out there without directly showing you anything. Each time that you were in an ocean-set environment, the game just seemed to put something on the other side of the radiation warning, just out of reach. Every creature that you saw was only a sample of what is possible further out with no one there to see. Any entry into a researcher's terminal stating that pre-war shellfish could live there only gives information as to how much life there is in the Sea of Fallout. The largest unknown part of the Fallout universe is the ocean itself. We have known about it since 1997, when a brown-colored ocean was seen on the coast of California, the water getting clearer as it goes further from the land. The brown color unexplained is why and if you were to ask someone, they may have not even noticed the difference at all over time with each game. The mystery and lore behind the ocean is expanding, and the creators knew something. Hing would be out there and chose not to include it, only until you see it. What the bombs and the FEV are doing to the 94% of all life on Earth, while only 5% of life in the ocean survived, does not seem to be relevant to you being left to rebuild society. Whatever is down there, it has had a very long time to become whatever it is now, with no monitoring, no intervention, and nothing to stop it. And the franchise knows exactly what it has been building and has just been waiting for the right moment to show it. The Nahant terminal entries, the brown coastline on the Fallout 1 map, Ada's throwaway line on the Commonwealth shore, Old Longfellow's very careful word choices, the fog crawler's actual file name in the game data, the cut underwater vault content, the Poseidon oil rig sitting 175 miles offshore with its reactor doing whatever unmaintained nuclear reactors do after 2 centuries underwater, all of it are open connections for a story the franchise has been setting up without telling. Every single one of those details was a deliberate choice. And if the franchise ever actually takes you there, into the water, below the surface, past the radiation warning the games have been quietly using as a boundary for 30 years, the coastline is going to feel like the safest part of the entire trip by a very wide margin. Because whatever is on the other side of that warning has had a lot of time, and no one watching, and absolutely nothing to stop it from becoming whatever it wanted to become. The question has never been whether something extraordinary is in the Fallout ocean. The lore already confirms that it is, in the form of every creature that crawls out onto a beach or emerges from the fog of a main island. The question is what exactly it is, at what scale, and what happens if it ever decides to stop staying in the water. That question has been largely unanswered since the first game, and the franchise is large enough now to answer it properly if it chooses to. But the ocean will still be there either way, still brown near the shore, still doing whatever 200 years of radiation and FEV and unchecked mutation does to the 94% of all life on Earth that nobody has been watching. If you've enjoyed the video and want to know what happened to space and Fallout and what's up there, click the video on the screen.